Hello, I'm Leslie Northup, Associate Professor in the Department of Religious Studies and Dean of the Honors College at Florida International University, and I will be guest hosting this month's Viewpoint. After 2 days of voting, the College of Cardinals have elected a new leader for the world's 1.2 billion Catholics. Cardinal Jorge Mario Bergoglio, the Church's 266th Pope, has taken the name Francis I. His appointment represents many firsts for a pope, including the first Jesuit and the first non-European. What does this choice mean for the future of the Roman Catholic Church, and is it the right one? Joining me to discuss Pope Francis I are Monsignor Casale, President of St. Thomas University, Elsie Miranda, Associate Professor of Practical Theology at Barry University, Henry Mack, Adjunct Professor at Florida International University and Instructor of Philosophy at Carrollton School, and Daniel Alvarez, Instructor in the Department of Religious Studies and in the Honors College at Florida International University. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's good to be here.
Monsignor, could you start us off with just a little bit of a brief overview of how this conclave works and how a pope is elected?
I'd be happy to. The 115 cardinals, after Mass and praying, went into the Sistine Chapel and were secluded. They then prayed again and started voting. There's no conversation between them as they're sitting there in the chapel. It is simply a vote, and they vote 4 times a day. Our new pope was elected on the 5th ballot, which meant they voted the first night, and then the next day they voted 3 times, and on the 4th time they elected him.
Is 2 days a standard sort of time to elect a pope?
It was quick, and it was a surprise.
So does that mean, do you think, that the cardinals knew ahead of time who they might want to vote for?
Remember, they had about 10 days of discussion among themselves. They called General Congregation of the Cardinals, and they were discussing issues, and they also got an opportunity to look at one another and listen to one another and get to know one another better.
Elsie, did you find this a surprising choice?
Surprising, not really. I was hoping that it would be someone from the global south. Argentina is, you know, as he said, el fin del mundo. Ushuaia is as close to the Antarctica as you could get. And he did joke with the cardinals after he forgave them for electing him and said, you know, you had to go to the ends of the world to find someone to elect Pope, which is himself from Latin America. And I think because there's so many Catholics from the global south today that it was time for a non-European. So I was hopeful that the cardinals would actually be courageous enough to do something like that and go outside the bounds of tradition.
Henry, what do you think happened to all the front runners?
It's an interesting question. I would wonder to what extent he was already a front runner in many respects. Like you said, he seems to bridge the traditional and the new. Being Italian was, I think, comfortable for the Italian contingency, and obviously the fact that he's from Latin America and the New World is very appealing and represents, I think, or demonstrates rather, the universality of the Church in a new way. And I would wonder, I think he probably was a front runner going into it. I don't know the inner workings or the politics of the conclave and to what extent the front runners were ignored or outshunned or outvoted. I don't think we'll ever know.
Well, there's an old saying, I believe, Fred Frank, that a cardinal who enters the election as a pope emerges as a cardinal?
Chi entra un papa esce un cardinale. Who goes in a pope comes out a cardinal, and many of them came out cardinals this time. I would think those cardinals have gone home relieved, the front runners.
Yeah. I don't think it's an easy job. Dan, what do you think, this man who's been elected is 76, there was a lot of talk that perhaps there would be a younger man appointed this time around. What do you think about the age and health factor?
Yeah, well, that was the consensus when Benedict resigned. You know, it's such a dramatic thing. You know, the last pope to resign was 1415, when the church was in a deep crisis. The Great Schism ended in 1415 with the Council of Constance. and the Pope was forced to resign, abdicate, so that the new Pope, Martin V, could get elected. It shows that this Pope was sending a message that he wanted somebody, at least he thought, he wanted somebody with energy, health, the disposition to take on the Vatican bureaucracy and bring about the kinds of reforms that he himself was not able to bring about. And then to see a Pope that many people are calling transitional, I think is quite shocking to me. Odilio Scherer, who's also Latin America, from Brazil, the largest Catholic country in Latin America, was one of the favorites, and yet he did not get elected. Now, Bergoglio came, I understand, second in the votes in 2005. So in a way, what you were saying might be true. There was already a consensus built around him that after Ratzinger, it would have been Bergoglio, and you had him here, and there he was. And apparently, because of his, even though he's 76, the fact that he has been willing to take on the government of Argentina and been very vocal about it showed that he had the energy, the disposition to take on this job. That was questioned in 2005, ironically enough, whether he had the, the fire in the belly to do it, to lead the church. Apparently, he's answered those doubts, and therefore he got elected.
You know, Henry, I've often heard it said that the last thing the church wants is a long papacy. Do you think that there's a message being sent by the cardinals that we don't want another John Paul II? We want someone who will make his mark but move on relatively quickly?
I don't know. Last time on the show, I thought it was long pope, long pope, short pope, etc. So right now we would be entering into a long papacy, and it's really quite unpredictable. And I think it goes to show that the cardinals are more concerned about the qualities, the dynamism, and sort of the personality rather than the age itself. So if they see a man who fits the bill, regardless of age, they're going to pick him. And so the 76 is really the new 56.
Frank, there's been a lot of talk about this being the first Jesuit pope. What are the Jesuits? Why should this be a big deal?
Well, for one thing, the Jesuits never sought honors. They have a rule, I believe they have a rule. If it's not a rule, it has to be a practice, that they really don't seek honors. There aren't a tremendous number of Jesuits, bishops throughout the world, even though they're the largest religious order in the world. And so in some respects, that goes along with that whole thing of never seeking honor. And of course, this is the greatest honor you could possibly have in the Catholic Church. So that would be one reason it's a little bit of an anomaly for a Jesuit. And secondly, the Jesuits have had a rocky history. They're a wonderful group of men, but not everybody has loved them at every time in history.
Especially the popes, too.
Especially the popes.
Yeah.
It was
Even though they started out as a papal order.
Yes.
But it also means that this is an intellectual pope. He may not be quite as intellectual as his predecessor, Elsie, but he does have his intellectual chops in line, correct?
No, absolutely. He's intellectual as well as pastoral, and the fact that he's chosen the name Francis is so meaningful, because Francis was a reformer and someone who was quite humble in interpreting the will of God in the context of his time. And I think that, so far, the firsts have been very meaningful, I think, in the direction that the church might be heading into.
What do you think it means to take a name never used before by a pope?
Well, particularly the name of Francis. He's only been around. Francis is a 1300. He's a figure from the 1300s. So, but he was a mendicant, and he really had a spirit of collegiality with the community as well as with creation. And given our situation as a planet, to raise some ecological consciousness, to be understood as brother, sister. How he addressed the community yesterday was very telling of, his demeanor. And, and Francis did say, go out into the world and preach, and if you must, use words. And,
but it also has to be said, going back to the issue of the Jesuits, that he's an anomaly among the Jesuits. The Jesuits today are probably the most liberal progressive order in the Catholic Church. And their champion was really Cardinal Martini of Milan, really the last progressive liberal in the Catholic Church. He died, so he, people thought that in 2005 perhaps he might be the gentleman, the cardinal to be elected pope, but that's gone. So the Jesuits, I understand, are not entirely happy with Bergoglio because he represents the most conservative right wing of the church, according to the Jesuits, who are very liberal by comparison.
Let's then talk a bit about his theology. Henry, is this Pope going to be a social reformer?
Socially, that's a good question. Doctrinally, I don't think there's any debate. The doctrine stands, and this man is very orthodox with respect to doctrine. And it's his job, as a matter of fact, to conserve or preserve the doctrine. But with respect to discipline and social issues, particularly the poor and social justice matters, I think there's a little bit of moderacy here. I think there's going to be a little bit of give and some change, I would expect. If we look to his time as Archbishop of Buenos Aires, I think we can see some evidence there of the extent to which he's concerned for the poor, particularly those with AIDS, cancer. Socially, with respect to those groups, I think there is something to be appreciated in him.
What about groups, Elsie, like gay people and women seeking abortions?
Yeah, I think not so liberal, but I think in the grand scheme of things, some of those social issues are really minute compared to the kinds of issues he really wants to address, like child prostitution and the hundreds of thousands of people that are getting sold into slavery. And his concerns are really have a much broader reach than those issues that are really predominantly of concern to North Americans and some Europeans.
By the way, I think he's open to the use of condom to prevent the spread of AIDS.
Well, his predecessor had already
opened
announced that
door.
was okay. So.
Absolutely, but you're right. On the issue of the homosexual, he's been very critical of the government of Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner for the very liberal policy of the government in terms of gay marriage among between homosexuals, the issue of legalized abortion, legalized gay marriage. So in those issues, I think he's really clashed. He's really very, very conservative.
Well, I don't think you could find a cardinal in that conclave that was going to have a different position, to be quite honest with you. So to label him as conservative because he's taking that position, I think may be a mislabeling of him.
They've all been appointed by either Benedict or his predecessor, correct?
Of course, and there's, as Henry said, they're there to preserve the doctrine of the church, and the doctrine of the church doesn't change overnight, and it doesn't change because people think it ought to change.
Right, well, his fellow Jesuits have been pretty open about all those issues: contraception, abortion, gays, and so on and so forth. So he's an exception to the
everything but women's ordination.
Yeah,
his fellow Jesuits weren't in line for the papacy.
Correct, but I was just making a philosophical point.